there. I am popping in real quick with a tutorial of sorts. 4th of July is seriously just around the corner, and we're planning on having a big shindig here at the property and around the pool and some fireworks and all of that, and I would be out of sorts if I did not have some kind of jewelry of my own to wear on the 4th of July. So I created this little baby. It's a red, white, and blue star necklace. Super easy, using some tins I had from the thrift store, because right now I'm really big into cutting tins apart and making things out of them. And while I was making it, I decided I'd go ahead and film the process and let y'all see how I do it, and hopefully inspire you to do something similar or ask me questions about it or whatever. So if you do have any questions at the end of all this, if there's something I didn't explain, please let me know. But I had a lot of fun making this, and I hope you find some inspiration in it. To get started on this project, here's a general idea of some of the supplies you'll need. I'm using just some basic like cookie tins. These I got all at the thrift store pretty inexpensively, about $1 or so, maybe, you know, somewhere in that area on average. Since I'm doing a red, white, and blue theme, I've got one with red, one with white, and one with some blue on it. To cut these apart, we'll use some fairly heavy industrial tin snips. These are from the hardware store, and I like them because they can get around these edges here on the side and really cut through to get it started. Once we get it cut down to a more usable size, I'll use stencils to trace my design. This is one I made on my Silhouette Cameo, and this is just a basic stencil from the craft store or whatever. I'll use a fine tip marker to trace that design, and then I've got some smaller tin snips here to do the detail work on the tin. Once we have it cut, we'll use different filing tools. I've got steel wool and sanding blocks, as well as a large metal file and some small metal files, and this is just an array of examples of things you can use. Use what you have on hand or what's accessible to you, but I'll show you how I use these. I probably or may not use all of these. Once I get them filed and sanded, we'll use metal hole punch to get holes in them, and then from there we'll go on to our jewelry supplies, which I'll use some chain and jump rings and clasps, as well as jewelry pliers and wire cutters to finish off the necklace. So let's get started. I'm going to clear some of these things away because I do not need them all to get started. To get started, I'm also going to be using, I can get some of this stuff off, I'm going to be using some safety equipment, and that includes safety glasses and some gloves. Now, the gloves are just to protect my hands a little from getting cut as I work with the tin, because it does have pretty sharp edges on it. To get started, I take my stencil and just kind of see how big of an area I need to cut out, and use those big old tin snips to cut out a little extra bit of area to make sure. And I cut the edges off there because they're raised, and I really want that tin to be as flat as possible when I trace that stencil on there. So I do that with all three of them. Now the second one, you can see there's a seam on the tin, and that's where I start my cut, just to make it easier in the future when I need some more of that tin. I don't have to deal with that seam taking up too much space or being in the way of what it is I'm going to need. So I cut down that seam, and then along the bottom, trying to keep as much of the tin as possible to be used, because I can always try to use some of that tin later, but if I cut too high, I'm just wasting it. So once I get that out, I lay them all down on a piece of paper and just flatten them as flat as possible. Now I'm using the paper just because those corners of the tin are really sharp, and I don't want them cutting into my table or my nonstick mat or anything. So that paper really kind of helps protect the surface a little. Once I get them flat, I pull my stencil back out and just use a fine tip marker to trace it. Now for the red one, I'm tracing on the back because the whole thing is red and is exactly what I need. But for the white and the blue, I'll be tracing the star images on the front. Once I get them traced, it's just a matter of cutting them out. And I'm using those more fine detail tin snips to do that process, so I can get in there a little bit better. After that, I'm taking some nylon jaw pliers just to flatten down the tin a little so I can get a better idea to make sure that those cuts were okay. And I'm using the detail tin snips again just to trim off those pointy edges of the stars. It makes them, I'd rather have them a little rounded than pokey. So once I get those, I just start filing with my big file. Now that big metal file covers a lot of area and it's great. Here I do pull out my small detail file to get some of the more little edges in there, but that large file works great. Now again, I'm using those pliers to flatten everything down, and I'm moving from here to my sanding block. I'm using the roughest block to the finest, making sure I get all the sides and the backs to make sure that everything's really smooth. Now the backs are important because that's what's actually going to be touching the skin. Once I use both sanding blocks, I'm going to use my steel wool to make everything just buttery and fabulous. And after that, I'm going to line up my stars and get them aligned just the way I want and figure out where my holes are going to go. Now, I'm marking those mostly so I make sure that in the process of moving things around, I don't turn those in some crazy direction and they don't end up being aligned the way I want them aligned. I may not be punching the holes exactly where I made those lines, but they're there. After that, it's down to the jewelry work, and I'm connecting the stars with just some basic jump rings, making sure that they are lined up in the way I want and facing forward. And I'm just using one large jump ring to account for the elongated tips of the stars. After that, I take a piece of chain and cut it down to size just using some wire cutters. And from there, I slide each end of the wire of the chain onto a piece of wire and to find the center and cut that chain in half. So I have two pieces. And those two pieces are just connected again with a simple jump ring on each end. I'm using smaller ones this time because the chain doesn't need as much room as those elongated arms of the stars do. And this is a super simple process to just twist. You can look at my video on using jump rings to see how to do that. And again, I'm using jump rings to connect the clasp, which is a simple spring clasp. And once that's connected on there, this necklace is done, baby. Now let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I appreciate y'all coming by and taking a look, and I'm sorry this was such a fast video, but I am welcome to answer any of your questions. Thanks guys, bye.